Hello and welcome to History Hack. We have yet another exciting episode for you today, but one that I'm exceedingly excited with because I'm joined by two fabulous ladies. Not only do I have one of my favorite authors with me, we're joined by Merrin as well, who is going to be introducing us. How are you, Merrin?
I'm all right, Mr. Bone. I'm not doing too bad. Yes, a bit of an exceptional event today. We are very privileged to have with us Clare Mulley, who is an award-winning author and broadcaster. And her first book, The Woman Who Saved the Children, was about Eglantine Jebb, who personally wasn't fond of children, but she established Save the Children in response to the First World War. I think that's right, isn't it, Claire?
It is.
And I think I'm also right in saying that won the Daily Mail Biographers Club prize.
It did.
Which is no mean feat, is it? And then let's go with some accolades and warm you up, because The Spy Who Loved led to you being decorated with Poland's national honour, the Benemerito.
Yes, felt very good. Wear that on my pajamas all the time. Haven't taken it off.
And then your latest tome, The Woman Who Flew for Hitler, I think has been longlisted for the Historic Writers Association Non-Fiction Crown.
Yeah, sadly didn't win it, but it was listed there, so I was very pleased. Yeah,
and that's who we're going to be talking about today, isn't it?
Yeah, it's about two absolutely extraordinary. There were only two women who served as test pilots for the Third Reich, and so my book is about the two of them. It's kind of a dual biography because they're fantastic foils for each other, very different women, and actually ended their lives on opposite sides of the war. But I think today we're focusing on just one of them, aren't we?
Yes, we're going to look at Melita. Now, her name is fabulous for a start. Melita Gräfin von Stauffenberg, is that right?
Yeah, Melitta or Litta.
Melitta. Okay. So start at the beginning. Tell us where Melitta was born.
So she was born in 1903 in Krotoszyn, which was a German province of what was then Posen. It's now part of Poland. So it was on that disputed territory in the sort of border area between Poland and Germany, which of course sort of was important and significant in her growing up with the First and Second World War and the borders changing around her.
Okay. And what sort of family was she born in? I mean, she wasn't born to be a pilot. What sort of family was she born into?
Well, her mum was a Protestant, came from quite an arty family. Her father was a civil engineer. He was kind of like a Prussian official. He was, sort of typical National Conservative of that Wilhelmina era. He had a very fine moustache that he would wax into points. You can just see the sort of photograph, the Victoriana photograph of him. And they were quite a big family, 5 siblings. She was very close to them, and they just had this very carefree middle-class life until the First World War interrupted it, really. Her father served, her mother and her elder sister served as nurses, and she got a real strong sense of duty and honour from that.
And you mentioned, was it her mother was Protestant? Was her father Protestant as well?
Her father was, but I mean, slight spoiler here. Her father came from this family from Odessa. And they were, a furrier family, and then they moved into clothing. And he had Jewish grandparents, Jewish parents, but his father actually converted to Protestantism, and he went actually to Lutheranism. And from a teenager, he considered himself to be a Protestant. He had converted, and he didn't ever sort of talk about his Jewish roots. He knew that there was obviously some sort of resident anti-Semitism, and he decided not to make that part of his life. And in fact, Melitta and her siblings only really found out that they had this Jewish heritage in 1935 when the Nuremberg laws came and the Nazis made it suddenly much more significant. So she grew up as a Protestant, but she did have this Jewish heritage through her father's line, then not through her mother's line. So
that's going to come back into the story in a little while. But we're going to get on to the exciting bit for me, because we're going to talk about flying. After the war, the Versailles Treaty meant that powered flight was out of the reach of many, but Melissa, like many others, went gliding. How did she learn to fly, Claire? How did that come into her life?
Well, she was always, absolutely fascinated by flight. Her mother's brother, her uncle Ernst Eberstein, had flown. He was actually an ace in the First World War, and he was very good friends with someone called Ernst Udet, who you might have heard of. And So I think during the war and just after the war, her uncle survived, and he would entertain all the children with stories of his daring do. He was known as the hero of one of the big engagements, and she had this real sense of honour in the skies, but also the power and the freedom, all those things, modernity that we associate, those values we associate with flight. She was really drawn by that, but she was also quite into the technicalities of it all. She had that very inquiring mind. So when, after, as you mentioned, the Treaty of Versailles really stopped motorised flight, it was banned under the terms of that treaty. And of course, it wasn't the Luftwaffe then, but the German Imperial Air Force was broken up and their aircraft were destroyed, as in literally, sawn into pieces. And this was, for an aviation family, very distressing, very sort of smack in the face. So what rose from that was non-motorised flight, gliding. And this became the sort of aspirational sport for German youth and young people who wanted to sort of compete for their country on the international stage again and try and bring a sort of sense of respect and honour back to Germany. They did this through gliding, and Melitta became quite fixated with gliding as well. She used to watch, when she went to boarding school in Hirschberg, she would watch all these young boys going to their gliding classes, and loads of school children would go down. You've got the odd photograph of little girls in their, black stockings and white dresses going down in two straight lines, basically, to watch the gliders. But Melitta was the only one who got stuck in. So when there was when the gliders had gone down the slope, she'd help pull them back up again so someone else could have a go. And if one went down with a hard landing, she'd sort of make a few suggestions of how it could be improved, and she'd try and help fix them. And eventually, in 1920, when she was 17 years old, she was rewarded with the opportunity to have a go in one of these very precarious contraptions. They're all made of canvas and bamboo and little bits of wood. So pretty dangerous kit, but she was desperate to have a go. And I think they just thought that she would slip down the grassy slope in it, a bit like a sledge or something like that. But she'd been watching pretty carefully. So although she'd had no actual training herself, she knew what to do. So as it's powered down the slope with these two lines of young men in their +4s and knitted jerseys, she knew at the right moment when to pull back on the stick and lift the nose of the glider, and up she went. And she knew when to, pull the trigger that released the cord that went spiraling away. And she went up into the air. And she said, after that, right from the start, flying exerted an irresistible magic on me. I was dominated all along by the longing for freedom. So it really gets into her system. And that was all in 1920. So pretty early on. She must have been one of the first women to have a flight in a glider like that.
I find that sort of period of the beauty of flight, that sort of rush that she got just from gliding, and she wasn't alone in that as well. There was this whole group of female aviators that came along with her. A couple of them were rather well known.
Extraordinary. But when you say, it was very it was the glamorous age of flight, really, wasn't it? Certainly as she went on and those gliders got slightly more, developed, and then again they put engines in them, and she was part of that set. Flying was very much seen as a male thing internationally, and it's no more so than in Germany, of course. But there were these pioneer women who were, became huge celebrities, like Amelia Earhart, and Amelia Earhart ended up having her own fashion line. And I think On Avion was the perfume of choice around this time. It was very much seen as a fashionable, dynamic thing. And there were a number of German pilots that Melitta was good friends with, like Magda von Ertsdorf, first woman to fly an airliner, who was an international, long distance flight record holder. Of course, she came to a very tragic end. She was forced to land. She was en route trying to fly to Cape Town, and she had to stop in Aleppo in Syria. And they found in her plane a model machine gun and some marketing papers on machine guns and other weaponry, and it seems that she must have been ferrying arms to supplement her income or something like that. And when she landed, she knew these would be found when the plane was checked, and so she went she asked for a quiet room to recover, and she went in and unfortunately she shot herself, killed herself. She couldn't cope with the shame of that. I mean incredible intense pressure on these people and no support systems, and she was doing something pretty serious there against of course that would have been against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, to be moving information on arms. other women like Ellie Beinhorn, absolutely amazing as well. I was very lucky because I interviewed her son when I was doing the research for this book. And because, you know, she knew Melitta quite well, but her own story is amazing as well. You know, she was the second person after Amelia Earhart to fly from Europe to Australia in a little Clem.
I was just going to say, this is an interesting time. You mentioned Europe and certainly 20s, late 20s, early 30s. I'm getting a sense of family, of, if not restoration, recuperation, and of things being really quite focused on getting back to life after the First World War.
Yes.
But early to mid 1930s, we start to see the Germans, we start to see moves afoot. What was the effect on Melitta and her family of political change?
Yeah, I mean, it was it had a deep impact, of course. And as particularly, I think, because the Nazis were deliberately aligning themselves with flight as well. So there was sort of like a connection in the air as well. In fact, Hitler took his first flight the same year as Melitta, but he wasn't in a little fragile glider, obviously. He was on a motorised flight from Munich to take part in the Cat Putsch, which didn't work. And he actually was apparently very sick out the window and hated it. They went through storms and things. He had a very terrible journey, but he recognised the potential for flight with that journey, and, you know, not just for sports, but for politics as well. So he very deliberately was linking the Nazi Party to those, you know, to those big symbols of modernity, pioneering force, and all those things. So Melitta was very interested in what was happening. But, you know, I think other people like Hannah Reich, who we didn't talk about, was another female pilot at the time, who's the second pilot in my book, the only other test pilot for the regime. You know, she really welcomed the rise of the Nazi Party. And she saw, you know, she focused on all her writing talking about the parades, the brass bands, the bunting in the streets. You know, Hitler's really taking the country back, growing sense of patriotism. But for Melitta, she picks up on very different cues. So she sees discrimination and violence on the streets with the brown shirts. And she sees, you know, not just communists being rounded up and disappearing, but also social democrats and some early church leaders. And of course, when the Nuremberg laws come in and she realizes the significance of her own Jewish heritage, really, she knows that this is quite a frightening regime from quite early on. She is never a Nazi.
It's the thing that sort of stands out so beautifully in your book is that difference between these two women with the same passion, but very, very different outlooks. And I find Hannah fascinating, but not as fascinating as Melitta, because of the situation she found herself in, but yet she had this very technical mind, didn't she? Whereas Hannah stayed very much as a test pilot, Melitta was an engineer,
Yeah.
more so than a test pilot, wasn't she?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they had a lot in common. So they were both great patriots. They were both absolutely brilliant natural pilots. I mean, otherwise the Nazis wouldn't have let them anywhere near their very expensive equipment. But apart from that, they were sort of diametrically opposite. In fact, they were buzzing around my brain sort of in opposite directions the whole time, like DNA swirling around out there or something. But so yeah, Hannah was a brilliant glider pilot. She was brilliant whatever she flew. She was actually the first woman in the world to fly a helicopter and ended up test flying the Comet, the Messerschmitt, you know, the rocket-powered Comet, the Messerschmitt 163. And in fact, she ended up testing, it's basically a prototype cruise missile, isn't it? The V1, absolutely extraordinary. But Melitta was much more than that. She had a much deeper understanding of it. She had studied, one of the, you know, few women at that time to study engineering at university. She went to the Technical University of Munich, just as Hitler, of course, was parading around Munich. So it was very much in her face, in her consciousness. And then she didn't, if there were other women studying engineering, they were sort of doing prototype Mulligans makers or things for the kitchen, you know, but she was doing aeronautical dynamics. So she was very highly trained, and she was working in the development of aerodynamics and various different components of the, what became the early fighter planes, the Junkers.
I can already see a really strong connection here. You've mentioned, I was going to say joyriding, not joyriding, but testing.
She actually did joyriding as well. She bikes, fast cars, she did the lot.
So she's really quickly secured her place in terms of value for the right. I mean, that must have impacted their family as well.
It wasn't that easy. I mean, you know, well, I don't know, in 1928, quite early on, is when she first she graduated and got her first job at the German Research Institute of Aviation. And she's looking into all these areas of aerodynamics and new technology of jet propulsion very early on, some of that rocket technology and so on. But in 1936, she's dismissed, and it's quite difficult to work out why, because they praise her massively for all her work, her attendance, her innovations, the engineering skills that she has, but they have to let her go. And it seems likely it's because it came out that she wasn't pure Aryan at that point. So, I mean, she loses her job and so on. But nobody can replace her. Nobody can do the work. She's been doing this very advanced work with, various forms of flaps and air screws and propellers and so on. And there isn't anyone that can really replace her. So she actually works for a civil aviation company, Ascania Works it was called. But she starts developing autopilot work, and that is really useful for the war. So she's brought back in, she's sort of seconded as a civilian back in. So yes, it does secure her, not just work, it actually she becomes very aware of her value to the regime, and she uses that to the full. She really exploits it.
And if anyone listening's ever seen the footages of the Ju-87 Stukas doing their dives and pulling out, the pull-out system was Melitta.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, I know that Ernst Udet wanted to have a go at that. I mean, they go down, it's 80 degrees. It looks vertical pretty much when you watch them. At the start of that dive, they might be going at 350 miles an hour. It's absolutely extraordinary. And Udet wanted to have a go. So he climbed in. He did a perfect, he's a wonderful pilot, Udet, all those stunt work he did between the wars. And he climbed in. He did a very good test dive, nose dive, as they called them. But afterwards, he just didn't get out of the cockpit. So the ground crew came running up, and his legs were shaking so much he couldn't support himself. It was terrifying. And I know that if a male test pilot in the morning tested a Stuka dive bomber, and then Melita might go away and, fiddle around with it a bit, make a few adjustments. If the same pilot went back and tested it again in the afternoon, which is, the preferred thing, so you get the continuity as much as possible, it wasn't just considered courageous. That was seen as heroic, twice in a day. But Melitta would do her own test dives as well. She would do up to 15 in a day. She did over 2,000 nosedive test flights in prototypes during the war, when nobody came anywhere near her. And the Nazis, of course, thinking, how can it be that a woman can do this mad work better than any of the men? They couldn't understand it. And they wanted to test her blood to see, they thought, they're Nazis. They thought of a biological, it must be a reason. Perhaps her white and red cells in her blood had a different ratio or something like this. It's ludicrous. Of course, there was a reason. And that was because she knew she had to make herself uniquely valuable so that she would be offered this very important equal to Aryan status, horrendous terminology. She'd been designated as what they called Mischling, or sort of half mixed blooded. And when they finally offered her that status, because they needed her, she was unique in what she could do. She actually refused it unless that status was given to her entire family. So she's working for the regime, trying to save her family.
I find that bit about Udet fascinating, because he was responsible for this sort of weird focus on dive bombers that the Nazis had, and that forced the Luftwaffe to make even their big twin-engined aircraft dive bombers that Milch then took on. And here's a guy who did one and didn't like it. It's just mad.
I've got a quick question. We mentioned that she's now secured some kind of preferred status for her family as well, which is genius. It seems logical when we think about it now, but what else was her family doing? Were they also employed in a similar vein?
No, not at all. They're all doing completely different stuff. I mean, so she had 4 siblings, and as early as possible, they all got out of Germany. They weren't, so one went to do some research in Spain on, it was dietary work. Another one was a sort of a specialist expert on agriculture and sort of trying to create a good harvest and crop, which obviously became very important with the idea of Lebensraum. And he was sent up to sort of later on, sent out to former Soviet territories after June 41 to sort of see what could be done there. So they're all trying to make themselves valuable, but they were all protected by Melitta. And extraordinarily, her entire family survived the war purely with her, really.
And is she still single at this point, or is she married?
She married in 37. So
okay. And was it somebody that she knew through work she married? I'm curious because she sounds so headstrong. She sounds so independent.
You've got to read the book, Sharon. You've got to read the book. I read the book, sorry, excuse me. She is headstrong and absolutely fantastic. She does marry, and I think it is partly because it's useful for both parties in this marriage. So she married wonderful poet, really, historian, poet, academic, called Alexander, and he came from a very old German family, one of the oldest and most distinguished Catholic German families. So it gave her that little bit more credibility, you know, to take that name as a well-known name. And he also, I mean, he had really sort of reached the glass ceiling in the academic world because he wasn't married, and all good German men were meant to be married. So they kind of came to this arrangement. I believe they really loved each other as well. But I know that she loved some other young men and had a wonderful affair with a lovely one arm or one leg, I can't remember now, gosh, a young pilot that went into the test program and worked under her, trained under her. But I think she did love Alexander very much, but I think it was useful for both of them, that marriage.
I was just going to say, let's spend a minute and talk about that famous old Catholic German family, the von Stauffenbergs, because you have some wonderful pictures in your book of Alexander and Lita, but then also his brother Klaus, who we know very well, but also his wife Nina and their kids. There's just some lovely family portraits, and you bring together this beautiful image of a family that we think we know through Klaus and the July plot, which we'll get to later. But the von Stauffenbergs were very much a family, and they do seem to have had a very close bond and welcomed Melitta in.
I mean, and still have a close bond. One of the wonderful things during my research is that I managed to get in touch with Berthold von Stauffenberg, who was the eldest son of Klaus von Stauffenberg, most famously played by Tom Cruise, of course, in Valkyrie, the film about the 20th of July plot, which is kind of central to my book as well, but from a very different angle. Anyhow, I managed to reach him, and he said, you know, I'm sorry, I've given so many interviews about my famous dad, and I honor him to this day, but I don't want to give another interview about him. And I was like, so it just, actually, I'd like to talk about your aunt. And he said, my aunt? No one's ever asked me about my aunt. I would love to talk about her. And you know, sometimes you interview people and they kind of told the stories and the anecdotes become sort of well polished. And he didn't have that. He said, well, it was bizarre actually. He said, well, do you know, I'm going away tomorrow, so I won't be able to help you, or day after tomorrow's, but unless you can get to me, you know, in the next 24 hours, the only time in my life I put the phone down, I went to Stansted and I got on a plane, had breakfast with him the next morning. It was just fantastic in his schloss. And silver service, it was amazing. And he was wonderful because he hadn't discussed her, and he loved his aunt. He remembered her, you know, Melitta would drive a little Topolino, an open topped little car, down these hairy mountain tracks, and she'd perch him, not even on the back seat, but on the back, on the boot at the back, and he'd just have to hold on as she went really fast down the mountain road. She loved speed and adventure and adrenaline, you know. So, but he had a lot of memories about her and her views on Hannah and her views on the regime. Absolutely fascinating and never really tapped into before. Oh, it was wonderful though as well. At the end, he said, I've only got sort of an hour or so, but after about 6 hours, we said goodbye, and he clicked his heels and kissed my hand. It was very sort of Prussian, you know, he still had that from the family. And then I was feeling all sort of a little flushed, and just the most incredible interview. And then this wonderful flourish at an end. And he said, you know, you should be careful shaking hands like that. And I just thought, oh, you know, why? This is pre-COVID, of course. I don't know why. And he said, you know, you're just 2 handshakes away from Hitler, because he had held his father's hand and Klaus had shaken Hitler's hand not long, you know, in the days before he tried to kill him. And it did give you pause for thought, because you can get that real rush of adrenaline when you're thinking about this incredible research and these stories haven't been told. And it just feels thrilling and wonderful. And then you've got to realize the whole time when you write a book like this, the context of it. Yes, she saved her family, but what was going on for everyone else? Yes, this happened, but isn't her work supporting the Nazi regime? You know, it's not clear cut. It's a very grey and fascinating area.
I think that's insightful. I think that's something we often forget when whatever we're reading about, specifically perhaps, and perhaps it's because there's discomfort. The Second World War is still so close. We tend to pocket things. We tend to think about binary discussions. The Germans did this, the French did that, the Italians did this, but it's not. It's so much more complex than that. And the stories interact, and families and individuals. they aren't just doing one thing and it's documented in the there's a whole life story to explore with each and every person we talk about.
You know, I interviewed veterans on both sides of the war, you know, Luftwaffe pilots, RAF, our greatest test pilot, Winkelbrand, all sorts in there. But in Germany, I was interviewing some of the families, and I'd say, do you have a photograph of your father or whatever? And they'd say, oh yeah, and they'd show me their father wearing the Iron Cross with the Nazi thing and doing the Nazi insignia salute. And that's the only photograph that they have of their father. So they've kept it, you know, and of course, this history is so much more involved there. And when people talk to me about, you know, the British war crimes, which, you know, the aerial bombing, the strategic bombing campaign, and you know, it's very interesting.
Where was Alexander posted to? Because Klaus very famously was in North Africa. Where did Alexander go? Because his military career was quite different to that of his brothers.
Klaus was I believe, in the invasion of Poland as well. Early on, he went all over the place, not just North Africa. Yeah, Alexander got various different postings as well. He spent a lot of time being trained. Melitta actually managed to go and visit him at training in, I think it was Czechoslovakia. She visited him. He accidentally got her rooms in what turned out to be a brothel. But anyhow,
as you do,
it was all quite interesting. And their reports on that are very interesting, and a friend of theirs, so that's all in the book. But he actually went out to the Eastern Front, and he was very badly injured there, with shrapnel lodged in him, and they brought him back, and he had quite a period of being on convalescence leave and survived that in Berlin. Yes, in Berlin. So they lived together during that time. She was sort of semi-caring for him. I mean, this amazing thing. She would go and do this incredible work, you know, at her drawing board all evening, and test flying dive bombers during the day. And then she'd go home, put her pinny on, take dictation for a few poems or an article that Alexander wanted to write, and cook him dinner. It's just, she was being the housewife as well, the Hausfrau, on top of everything else. And her salary was, you know, 10 times his. By the end of the war, she had a whole research institute under her responsibility. You know, she reported directly to Goering. Amazing stuff. Anyhow, after he recovered from that, she managed to pull a few strings, and he got posted out to Greece, which is where he was in 44, where he was there, you know, with the army, but also in his role as a historian.
Claire, you give the impression that she's a polymath. Would you say that her interests as much as her capabilities extended that far?
Well, she was very talented. I mean, the engineering skills are second to none. Her physical endurance, and I mean, she'd always been a brilliant skier, diver, hiker, all of that. And so she's got all that. But she mainly relaxed by sculpting. She was a very good sculptor as well. My husband's a professional sculptor, and we you know, he was quite impressed by some of her pieces. So yeah.
Your two women in The Woman Who Flew for Hitler, Hannah and Melitta, I wouldn't say covet, but they both desire the Iron Cross. And it's something that's very, very recognizable to everybody. But I suppose a good question to start with is, what is it? What is it awarded for? And I guess, what did it mean when Melitta was awarded it?
Well, it's a military decoration, not a civilian decoration, although Hannah and Melitta were both awarded it. And of course, they weren't in the military. They were civilians seconded to the military. So they are very interesting there. I mean, it's a very old honour. First, it was a Prussian honour, and then it was given in for the German Empire, First World War. Her own father got the Iron Cross. Hitler, of course, got the Iron Cross 1 and 2. Well, you got the second class, and then you got the first class for his work in the First World War. So yes, both Hannah and Melitta got the Iron Cross, were awarded the Iron Cross. Hannah was the first woman in the Second World War to be awarded the Iron Cross. She got the second class first. And that was for her work pretty early on. She was testing this, you know, Britain's main defense was the barrage balloons from the bombers, because they you know, they don't just float around. They're tethered on these actually quite slender but very strong steel cables. And if you're going fast, especially at night, and you don't see them, you fly into that. It's got the capacity to saw the wing off a plane and send you spiraling down. So the Germans had developed something called a wing blade, which was sort of like, you know, a knife basically stuck on a fender in front of the wings and avoiding the propeller. And she was testing that, I think, that quite early on, before they realised her sort of celebrity value to the regime. And she tested that, and I mean, incredibly dangerous. And the cable, you know, it cut it. She was jolted. She felt the plane jolt, and the cable swung, and it was sliced. But unfortunately, the end of the cable swung into the propeller, smashing it and sending shards of that through the cockpit. And she just about got away with her life. Anyhow, so she got the Iron Cross second for that, and then later got the Iron Cross first class as well. And Melitta was the second woman to get the Iron Cross during the Second World War, which she got for her work with dive bombers. I mean, interestingly, Hannah was given it directly, personally, by Hitler, but Hitler wouldn't meet Melitta. But Goering did, and there is a photograph of Goering shaking her hand, giving her the Iron Cross of second class. And she wrote a little diary piece about it, because one of the wonderful things is I found her diaries, handwritten 1943-44, never really looked at for because they're not in a military archive, and sent back to the family, basically marked as domestic or whatever, so not really used. Anyhow, and in this diary, she talks about Goering, and apparently they had, fish pancakes and a nice light wine, and it is fascinating. But the crosses meant very different things to these women. So for Hannah, one of my favourite sets of photographs in the book is I've got their official photographs to mark receiving the Iron Cross, which was a portrait shot done at, Hitler had his favourite photographer. So down there. And Hannah is staring into the camera with this Cheshire cat grin, and, the Iron Cross proudly on display and absolutely beaming. Oh, there it is. There's Hannah's at the top and Melitta's at the bottom. What a contrast. So it's one of the few Iron Cross portraits where she's not actually looking at the camera. She's not smiling. In fact, it looks like she's trying to fight a smile and where is her Iron Cross? There's no medal in that photograph. That's the only one I've seen like that. But it is actually there. I don't know. Can you spot it, Matt? There's a little bow on her lapel. And it's made from the ribbon of the Iron Cross, which Alexander took to get enamelled at the jeweller's for her. So it's got no swastika in it. There's no Nazi symbol in there. So, I think, looking back, it's very clear what these pictures are telling us. At the time, it's surprising they couldn't read that better then.
They're absolutely remarkable, because the one of Hannah is very well known. I think it was in every documentary she appeared in, wasn't it? But the Melita ones, you just see the little black and red ribbon on her button, and that little enameled one as well. It's fascinating, and every once in a while I think you come across a new photo of her, and you just see that little ribbon on her jacket, and that's it. I don't think there is one of her actually wearing the cross itself.
No, I didn't find one. No, obviously it's important to her because it's another sort of statement of acceptance by the regime. It's useful in that regard. But
there's more of a sense of humility about it, though, whereas Hannah's is about there's definitely a effusive sense of achievement, but there's more of a humility with Melitta.
But of course, Melitta doesn't really want to be aiding the Nazis. The irony is that she was probably more useful to the Nazis than Hannah. they were both very useful, but Melitta's work is absolutely extraordinary. So.
Did she do anything? We hear a lot about heavy water sabotage. I thought where I'm going with that is did she actually do anything antagonistic to try and mitigate what was going on?
Well, yes, she was sort of quite central to the most famous assassination plot on Hitler, attempt on his life. But she doesn't really appear. It's one of the most written about episodes of the Second World War, isn't it? But she very rarely appears in any of the accounts of it. So it was absolutely remarkable to uncover that story. I couldn't believe I was writing this book. There were only 2 women that served as test pilots for the Third Reich. Yeah. One of them, Hannah, was a fanatical Nazi. Melitta was part Jewish, or she had Jewish heritage. One of them, Hannah, tried to save Hitler's life at the end of the war in the bunker. Melitta, central to the most famous attempt on his life. You couldn't get more opposites. They seem to sort of, in the story of just 2 women, you encompass so many facets of the war and German attitudes and what could and could not be done.
Melitta's position, again, that actually helps the planning of that plot, isn't it? Because she was allowed to sail, wasn't she? Which means it's very hard to listen in on someone on a boat.
That's exactly right. Pilots had various privileges, like, pilot's chocolate. I don't know if we're going to talk about
we'll
that.
Come back to the chocolate.
Okay. And various other privileges. And one of them was that Melitta was allowed to sail a yacht on the Wannsee, which is the big lake in Berlin, of course. And exactly as Matt said, if you're on a boat in the middle of a lake, you can't really be overheard. So you will see, in her diaries, which are sort of semi-coded, lots of initials rather than names and so on, she was being cautious in writing them. Probably not cautious enough, but they didn't actually cause anyone harm. But you can see that she is, throughout the spring of 44 and the summer, she's inviting all these people that we worked at. So it's Klaus, Berthold, Alexander, her husband's twin, all these people that are central to the plot are being invited to go swimming at the Wannsee and sailing on the Wannsee. And this is what they're doing. They're discussing, they're making some of the arrangements. But then as we move towards June and July, increasingly, she's actually visiting Klaus's Tristanstrasse flat, which was basically Conspiracy HQ. She's there 2 days before the bomb plot. I mean, there's no way she's just going for a chat. At this point, everyone that's going there is involved in planning for that plot. And she was as well. I didn't get to interview her, sadly. She had died before then, but there's a couple of recorded interviews with people who did know her, as well as my own research. In one of these recorded interviews, a gentleman that's no longer with us, he talks of how Melitta had told him that Klaus and she had planned for her to fly him to the Wolf's Lair to put the bomb down. She was the pilot for the plot. But in fact, when it came to it, the aircraft that she had earmarked to take in that day were taken out by someone else off the books. She couldn't get access to them. They must have known maybe a couple of days before. And so he was flown in by Luftwaffe adjutant, which, they had other plans. But she was, central to the initial concept of how that was going to work.
Incredible life.
Yes.
I don't think we need to go into the plot, but what happened after it fell apart? Because Klaus famously executed the following morning, but there's this quite large family there, and then you have Melitta in quite a powerful position as well, who is sort of implicated by association more than anything else.
Well, they rounded up. I mean, all of the von Stauffenberg family were rounded up and put in prison. And Melitta she was actually due. She was about to get her Iron Cross First Class. She'd been proposed and nominated successfully for her First Class Iron Cross. But instead of getting that, she was sent to prison, and that was that for the honours, obviously. And so while she was in prison, she actually heard that Berthold von Stauffenberg had been taken out and hanged in the most grotesque manner. She heard of the deaths of many of the other plotters while she was in there, and just appallingly, bizarrely, they allowed her to keep her diary with her, so she continued to write in it, which is a fascinating document. And, I thought that would be the end of it. They rounded up about 2,000 people. They weren't all Stauffenbergs, obviously, but they just sort of took this as a good opportunity to get rid of all sorts of people that they could, that were incriminated. Or they just thought were against the Nazi regime, and this was just a good moment to get rid of a load of people. And many of them were executed, and I had believed that was what happened to Melitta. But ... actually, she went on, and her life didn't end there. She managed to talk her way out. I don't really want to go on to what she did next, but she's given this incredible accolade. She did this extraordinary second part of her wartime life then. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, we're going to save that. If you want to find out what happens, you'll have to go buy Claire's book.
Thank you, yeah.
One of my favorite bits, and we've talked about this in the past, is Melitta had access to Luftwaffe rations, of which one of them was chocolate, which was a very rare commodity as well, which she would give to her nieces and nephews. As a parent, I would hate this, because what was in the chocolate?
Oh, it's so lovely. I went to interview on a separate trip. I went to interview some of Melitta's side of the family. So these are the children of her brothers and sisters, her nephews and nieces. And one of them, wonderful woman, I'd interviewed her, and she remembered they lived quite near one of the airfields at Rechlin, where Melitta did some of her test work. And whenever Melitta was there, she'd go and see the family, and she would take them her chocolate rations, because the kids obviously had no sweets at this time. And so they were absolutely thrilled by this. The woman I was interviewing was the elder of two, and she said that she would take the lion's share of it and give her little brother, a few chunks of it. But she loved it. She said she was bouncing off the walls for days. And it's not much of a surprise, because this chocolate was called Schock-Cola, because it was chocolate, caffeine and Coca-Cola, all designed to keep those pilots going in the sky. And the pilots knew that. What they didn't know, it was also rammed full of pervitin. So, it was an upper drug, and she would have been bouncing off the walls. So, yeah.
Yeah, literally clawing her off the ceiling, I would have thought. Like I said, we're gonna leave the rather remarkable, I don't want to say return to form, but that final chapter in Melitta's story for those to read the book. But the book's been out for a few years. How have people been reacting to it? Because everyone I've spoken to who's read it has loved it, and I just wanted to see how it's been for you since its publication.
Well, I am very proud of it. I mean, it's done well. I'm very pleased. It was a runner-up for that prize, which was nice. It had some fantastic reviews, and it's continuing to sell pretty well. So I'm pleased. But I would love someone to option this. I just think maybe not so much film, or maybe I'd be quite happy. But I can just see a TV series. There are so many episodes in here that are so dramatic, and the twinning of these two women. One Aryan fair, one not, and of course they knew each other. The only two women often working in these airfields with a line of men in their uniforms, and the only two women that were at the Berlin Aero Club in their own right, not just as a wife or secretary sort of thing. And they knew each other so well, but all the stories are they refused to even have a cup of tea with each other. And there was one incredible moment where Hannah actually accused Melitta of making a sexual pass at her. Just extraordinary. I mean, that's the last thing Melitta would have done. She had more than one man anyhow. But even if she was bi, she was far too clever to go for Hannah, who she had no respect for, thought was quite foolish, and knew would have shocked her anyhow because she was a complete Nazi. There's no way that Melitta would have done that. But Hannah, on the other hand, maybe she admired Melitta a little more than she liked to say. Maybe it's who knows? But the fascinating psychology of the relationship between these women, I think it could just be really interesting on screen if anyone's doing that. But also I just think it gives us a different way into the war, doesn't it? It's a very different story that you don't normally hear, and I think it humanizes it, but the horror, the weight is still there, but also it has this very personal human doorway in. And I think a lot of people said to me after the book came out, well, some people, not many, some people said, isn't it good you've written the other side, you've written about the good Nazis? And I haven't done that because there aren't good Nazis. You can't put those words together. And somebody said to me, isn't it, I love books about difficult women. And I hate all this sort of cliche, dumbing it down. What I tried to do was write about two real women who made very different decisions. They're both very brave, but only one of them had real moral courage. And I think they clearly responded in very different ways to life under the perverting conditions of war and dictatorship. But one of them decided to do much more and put her life on the line for her principles, and chose, not everyone was in a position to do that, but this is sort of asks some of those questions, what could be done? And this is the story of one of those very courageous women. And I think if it just tells one thing in a very simple way, perhaps it's the absolute hypocrisy of a regime that thought there was only one real place for women, Kirche, Cooker, Kinder, and there was no place for Jews at all, of course, in the Third Reich. And yet when they needed them, they were prepared to give their highest honours to two women in the very, supposedly masculine field of flight, one of whom the Nazis themselves defined as being Jewish.
Complete and utter hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
It continues to fascinate me when did this come out? Last year, your book? Was it last year?
No, a couple of years
ago. But it continues to fascinate me that stories that are this complex and this wonderful are still surfacing. And thank goodness they are, because the idea of not knowing this story, her work was important, but her role was important as well in teaching us today that there is more to life than the black and white of war.
I think that grey area where the nuance is, the aching nuance, that's where the most important the most interesting stories are. So yeah, I couldn't believe it when I was researching it, the stuff that I found that hadn't been looked at. But I think there is this, still quite a rich seam of untold women's stories as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think there are a lot of untold stories that hopefully will come to light.
This has been a lot of fun. Claire, thank you so much for joining us again. Do you want to give the book a shout out once again? What's it called?
It's called The Women Who Flew for Hitler. And I think, I don't think you said, did you, that you're doing this pod to mark the 76th anniversary of Melitta's death. So that's the hook for us bringing it out today. But it's called The Women Who Flew for Hitler.
Yes, I totally forgot that. And that was the first thing I said in my text, wasn't it? Yes, 76 years, people. So please pick up this book and read it in her honor, because she is a remarkable woman. I think you'll find Hannah equally interesting, but in very different ways. And I think we should probably do do a chat about her at some point as well, Claire, because her story is remarkable, doesn't really cover it.
It's amazing.
Thank you so much for joining us. Merryn, thank you for being with me as well. And we shall be back with more exciting stories with you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
I'd like to thank Clare Mulley for joining us once again on History Hack. If you've not caught up with episode 30, you can go back to hear Claire talking about her amazing book about Christina Skarbek, The Spy Who Loved. The Spy Who Loved and The Women Who Flew for Hitler are both available on our very own bookshop. If you head to bookshop.org/shop/history hack, you'll be able to find Claire's books and all the books of our latest guests as well. 10% of every purchase through our bookshop goes to supporting the podcast. So not only do you support our amazing guests, you support us as well. And we cannot thank you enough for that. And of course, we always have to end with the Patreon bit. In 2020, when the boss ladies, Alex and Alina, started History Hack, the world was very strange. And unfortunately, it looks like 2021 is going to be equally strange. We would love it if you're able to support the podcast in any way. It will allow us to keep up the regularity of the pods and also the great guests that we've been able to bring you over the last year. We exist on Patreon as History Hack and also on Podbean, our podcast host's own platform called Patreon. The reward tiers are being updated at the moment, so there's going to be some fantastic options for you to choose from. So if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. So we thank you very much, and until the next time.